Jeez Louise, I gotta get faster at making these. Today, I'll be redesigning the creatures from Walking with Dinosaurs, Cruel Seas. This is an episode I actually didn't really like when I was younger. I'm not sure why. It might have been because I had a bit of a dinosaur bias when I was a kid. Good thing that wore off. But nowadays, it's one of my favorite. The tone, cinematography, and atmosphere are just peak television. The theme is also just impeccable. It really showed the overarching narrative of a cold brutality and primordial nature that the world had, even if that second one is kind of an antiquated view of prehistory nowadays. I want to give thanks to Mark Whitten's blog, Adam Smith's Plesiosaur Directory, Darren Nash's Marine Reptiles book, and Walking with Dinosaurs, the evidence for a lot of the information in this video. Everything I reference will be cited in the description as always. I'm also going to make references to the Walking with Dinosaurs, a natural history book occasionally, but not extensively. That book is kind of its own thing. It has different events and sometimes contradicts the show. For example, in this episode, the main character is actually a Cryptoclidus female and not Ophthalmosaurus. I do also want to note that a lot of the sources I use in this video involve Dave Martell, including the evidence book. I think it's important to note that Dave Martell is not a good person. He is a bigot, he has neo-colonialistic views, and at best doesn't care about the ethics behind fossil poaching, and at worst actively supports it. The same is true of Eberhard Frey, who shows up in all of the papers I'm citing, and also is a co-author on many of the papers that Martell has been criticized for their dubious provenance. And I figure it's important to mention this sort of thing, even if the science is useful. Paleontology is kind of terrible at holding people accountable at times. Oh, and on that topic, apparently Tim Haynes supports Gen AI. Yeah, he added a bit endorsing it in his guest appearance at DinoCon this year. If I had a nickel for every time a person I looked up to was found to support AI during the week I wrote this script, I would have 2 nickels. Which isn't a lot, but it's depressing that it happened twice. How's my Doofenshmirtz impression?
That was one of the worst impressions I had ever heard.
Okay, let's actually get into it. Cruel Seas takes place 149 million years ago in Oxfordshire, the northern edge of the Tethys Ocean, where Europe will one day be formed, and was currently just a series of scattered archipelagos. The animals from this episode are mostly from the Oxford clay. This is a formation from the Calovian and Oxfordian stages of the Middle Jurassic. However, that means that we've time traveled a bit. The Oxford clay is thought to be 164 to 159 million years ago, not 149. 149 million years ago would be latest Kimmeridgian to earliest Tithonian age in the Jurassic. Just getting that out of the way so I don't have to keep on saying that with every animal that isn't Rhamphorhynchus, the horseshoe crabs, and the unnamed invertebrates. The episode really hammers home that this place is ruled by marine reptiles, that dinosaurs and land animals in general were small island hoppers.
Large dinosaurs are rare here.
In relatively unproductive terrestrial ecosystems. This is wrong to a degree. Eustreptospondylus is called the largest dinosaur here.
And at 5 meters from nose to tail, Eustreptospondylus is the biggest.
And it's portrayed as the only one, but this isn't the case. For one, Metriacanthosaurus, which is more famous than Eustreptospondylus at this point I think, would have coexisted with it in the upper Oxford clay, while the slightly older parts of that formation yield the sauropod Cetiosauriscus, the Thyreophorans Lexovisaurus, Loricatosaurus, and Sarcolestes, and the ornithopod Calovisaurus. Yes, there aren't any named herbivores found to be contemporaneous with Eustreptospondylus, at least that I know of, but it and Metriacanthosaurus would have eaten something, right? Okay, on to the actual designs. We'll go by order of appearance for this. Eustreptospondylus, the victim of the biggest gotcha in paleo history. As a kid, I never really liked the animal. I only knew it from this show and thought that it was kind of boring with an ugly design. Turns out it's actually really interesting in its own right. First, let's get the obvious out of the way. This is very clearly a reused and modified version of their Allosaurus model from Time of the Titans. Eustreptospondylus is a megalosauroid, so it's not closely related to Allosaurus. However, I can't entirely blame the show's creators for this, and not just because of budget. Eustreptospondylus was named by Walker in 1964. This was kind of an odd read since it was almost entirely a paper on Ornithosuchus, and he just names and briefly describes Eustreptospondylus and Metriacanthosaurus almost like an afterthought. But in his descriptions, Walker emphasizes how similar Eustreptospondylus was to Antrodemus. Antrodemus is a synonym of Allosaurus and was actually the more used name for a while. In fact, the holotype was so bad we only recently got a neotype for Allosaurus that was proposed by Carpenter and Paul in 2010. Couple that with Greg Paul's reconstruction from his seminal predatory dinosaurs of the world being so very similar to Allosaurus, and you can see why they thought that reusing the model was a good idea. The original reconstruction of the skull even had the sloping triangular head you see in the Walking with Dinosaurs Allosaurus. Speaking of the holotype, Eustreptospondylus actually has a really good one, especially for a megalosaur, with most of the skeleton being known. But the osteology of this animal wouldn't become clear until 2006 in a work by Sadler et al. The material had been described much earlier by Franz Nopska, I think I'm so sorry if I butchered that. There is this skeletal that he created, which is interesting in its own right. It has 4 fingers and a snarl that reminds me of outdated Giganotosaurus reconstructions. Here it's considered Streptospondylus since it wouldn't be given its own name for another few decades. Von Huyn also made a reconstruction of the Eustreptospondylus material under the name Streptospondylus. Here it looks a bit closer to the typical pre-Sadler et al. Idea of the animal. Something that I'll note here, and in Paul's works, is that they depict Eustreptospondylus with lacrimal crests, very likely pulling from Allosaurus/Antrodemus. However, Nopska and Sadler, in their reconstructions, have them more correct. Eustreptospondylus was a very unornamented animal, with very smooth and low lacrimals. So the fact that the show basically made it an Allosaurus without having lacrimal horns is fitting, really. Although there shouldn't be a prominent brow ridge either. What's more interesting is the reinterpretation of the skull. It was actually much longer and lower with a far less triangular profile. In fact, it even had a bit of a notch at the premaxillary-maxillary contact. This makes Spinosaurids being megalosauroids a bit more obvious. Because of this change, it may have even been better adapted for eating fish or other prey that turned up from the surrounding waters. Although I wouldn't go so far as to say they were specializing in them. However, thanks to work on theropod facial nerves by Barker et al. In Neovenator and others, we know that theropod muzzles were extremely sensitive and quite likely sensitive enough that the pathway from the typical condition to the extensive system of neurovascular canals seen in Spinosaurids, most recently shown by Pate, is decently clear. Side note, that's what people should have taken from that paper, not that he sunk Suchomimus into Cryptoclidus. Brian Curtis made a good video on this, but regardless of how convincing the argument for sinking the taxon is, it's just a name. The actual animal hasn't changed. Hot take, if you get upset about Suchomimus no longer existing, you don't care about Suchomimus, you just thought the name was cool. What's fascinating in regards to Eustreptospondylus' skull is that Balker et al. Actually reconstructed a really modern looking one all the way back in 1992. Thanks to Mickey Mortimer for pointing that out in the comments of Scott Hartman's blog on Eustreptospondylus. What's also worth noting is that Balker et al. Also note that the brain case of Eustreptospondylus has anatomy that would indicate adaptations for greater ventroflexion at the head to neck joint, which would have been beneficial for fishing, if you think about it. If you follow me on Instagram, you may be wondering why I chose to give my design a nasal crest. Didn't I just say that Eustreptospondylus was undecorated? That is true, but Andrea Cow has pointed out that we actually don't have the nasals of Eustreptospondylus, or any megalosaurid from that matter. Couple that with the fact that Spinosaurids actually do have a midline crest made of their nasals, and the fact that nasal crests appear quite frequently throughout the theropod group, and yeah, it's a cool idea that's also not unlikely. It's more conservative to depict Eustreptospondylus undecorated, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's more accurate. Remember guys, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Within reason, of course. The rest of the inaccuracies on this guy are just general theropod stuff. Lips, less visible fenestrae, nostrils farther down and forward. One thing I will say before moving on to the postcrania is that the eyes are weirdly high up in the orbit. Maybe this was supposed to be some sort of fishing adaptation, or to keep the eyes above the surface of the water? I'm not sure, but it looks very strange. Oh, and by the way, the episode shows Eustreptospondylus hunting on coral atolls and hunting Rhamphorhynchus, even jumping on one, which I don't think they could do. But this contradicts the claim the narrator makes, which is that it's a beachcombing scavenger.
They are primarily scavengers, combing the beaches for dead animals.
Found anything yet? Nothing yet, sir!
The scavenger behavior we see depicted is much more just opportunism to me. I will say that the swimming is totally valid, and it's just so cute to see the way this guy swims with its little doggy paddle. I think the fingers could be narrower, and they should probably have an enlarged thumb claw. Spinosaurids have them, and while we don't have direct evidence of these in Megalosaurids proper, Galton and Jensen referred a giant thumb claw to Torvosaurus back in 1979. So, you know, there is that. The torso seems a bit too compact, and the tail tapers too quickly. In terms of integument, I think it's quite likely that Eustreptospondylus was feathered. I chose to feather my Allosaurus, and the same logic applies for here. The homology of dinosaur feathers and pterosaur pycnofibers, the widespread presence of feathers within Dinosauria, and in this case we may have more direct evidence. Skiurumimus and Juravenator are two feathered theropods only known from a single juvenile specimen. Both of these have been interpreted as young megalosauroids, even if they have generally been considered compsognathids by some other studies. If they truly are megalosauroids, then this would be direct evidence of the family having feathers. While I think there's some good arguments for taxa like Skiurumimus, Juravenator, and Scipionyx being juveniles of non-Coelurosaurs, I don't think that Compsognathidae as a whole is going to implode. I really just think a few taxa are going to be yoinked from the family. Maybe I should make a whole video on Compsognathidae. Who knows? Let me know. Finally, let's talk about size. The show says that they were 5 meters long, but the evidence book notes that the holotype is an immature animal, and this is agreed upon by Sadler et al., and the evidence book further goes on to say that they could have gone up to 10 meters. Sadler et al. Give a total length of 4.5 meters for that individual. Paul estimated it at 4.63 meters, and Holtz gave an adult estimate of 7 meters in 2007. 5 meters is actually a fine conservative estimate for an adult size. People sometimes misconstrue a fossil animal being immature as it having a ton of growing left to do, but I'm unaware of any histology done on the specimen, so exactly where it was in its growth curve is unknown. It's the next day. Sorry for those who love continuity. Hello? Is this the elephant in the room?
Yes.
Liopleurodon is easily the most infamous part of Walking with Dinosaurs. Even if other animals were more inaccurate in terms of morphology, the idea that the show signed off on an apex predator this big is legendary. So much so that I've already dedicated an entire video to how big Liopleurodon actually was, and that's just part 1. Because I've yet to cover fragmentary stuff used to justify the Liopleurodon size, as well as the actual largest pliosaurs. I definitely recommend watching that video and subscribing to know when those future ones come out. Hey, maybe become a member to get those videos early? Anyhow, I'm not going to go into the size of Liopleurodon here. We are just here purely for the design itself. Okay, I'll shout out one more video. The show states that Liopleurodon had a directional sense of underwater smell. An idea so fascinating, I gave it its own video. But anyway, the design. The head looks a bit wonky. It kind of looks like if you took a modern Liopleurodon skull and smashed it with a hammer. This appears to be because of 2 reconstructions that were referenced. The first is this skeletal and muscular restoration that appears in Newman and Tarlow 1967. This was the only published skeletal restoration of Liopleurodon until 2022, I believe. It's dubious since a lot of the material used in its creation is likely not even from Liopleurodon, but that's something I'm saving for those future videos I mentioned earlier. While that was a base, this mount, GPIT PV393, though it had a couple of previous names, was of particular influence in the skull, particularly in the splayed and forward-facing teeth. The mounted skeleton at Tübingen has some baggage, with restoration, warping, and possibly being a composite, although the most recent study thinks it's one animal save for an ilium. That paper's reconstruction of Liopleurodon's body is what I will be using in this video, and I explain more about why that's the case in my Liopleurodon size video. Liopleurodon should have a head roughly a quarter of the length of the animal, something Newman and Tarlow's restoration does indeed do. But where it differs is Liopleurodon would have had a shorter tail, a longer torso, and a longer neck. The head should be slightly upturned instead of downturned. The eyes should be farther forward and down. And the tooth row should be straight, save for the premaxilla-maxilla diastema. While some marine reptiles, like ichthyosaurs, have stupendous soft tissue specimens, plesiosaurs don't have this luxury in most cases. There are 3 important specimens I want to highlight. Let's start off with the holotype of Mauriciosaurus. That animal is one of the rare plesiosaurs with impeccable soft tissue preservation, and it tells us a lot. For starters, the flippers of plesiosaurs were larger than we thought. Traditional reconstructions usually have the soft tissue outline of the flippers close to the actual silhouette of the bones. Now we know there's a large trailing edge made entirely of soft tissue. The body of Mauriciosaurus preserved a lot of what appears to be adipose tissue, or fat. While it may be developmentally different from mammalian blubber, the idea is the same. This Liopleurodon lacks any kind of fat or blubber, from the looks of it, and this was something stated by the evidence book because it lived in warm seas. In my last video, I explained that this was kind of a dumb idea, since all endothermic marine animals either have blubber or something similar, with the exception of sea otters, which have super thick fur and have extremely high metabolic rates to accommodate for this and not freeze to death. While endothermy in plesiosaurs wouldn't be confirmed until after the show had come out, the depiction of the plesiosaurs in the show was far from cold-blooded. I will concede that the Liopleurodon itself is kind of sluggish in the show, though, even if we take that into account. Leatherback sea turtles have blubber, so it's still kind of strange. On the topic of fat, the tail is especially fatty. Frey et al. Liken it to the fat deposits of lizards like fat-tailed geckos. Frey et al. Argue that even though crocodilians deposit their fat in between the caudofemoralis and ischiocaudalis muscles, that because of how extensive the fat deposits in this plesiosaur are, that this must have been subdermal, and because the muscles of the tail are constrained by the transverse processes of the caudal vertebrae, Mauriciosaurus would have had a very weak tail, despite it being so bulky. I'm not sure how much I agree with that, since this cross-section of an alligator's tail from Mallison et al. 2015 shows the caudofemoralis femoralis muscle clearly extending beyond the transverse process, but I think regardless the conclusion is pretty similar in that plesiosaurs would have had pretty weak tails, at least compared to their compatriots. And this specimen shows that plesiosaurs were scaly. There were scales organized transversely along the belly and radially at the base of the flippers. A different plesiosaur specimen, described in 2026 by Marks et al., show that certain parts of the skin was scaleless, the tail specifically. Scales weren't preserved in the tail of Maurosaurus, so this could be a broader trend in plesiosaurs. The scales on the right forelimb of this unnamed plesiosaur were keeled, and were compared to the scutes of a turtle's carapace and the scales of mosasauroids. These scales would have been too small to see at normal viewing distances, but it's interesting to note regardless. Finally, there is the holotype of Coelosaurus. This was super important because it was the earliest example of soft tissue preservation in plesiosaurs, and is the main source for a very interesting topic regarding their life appearance, that being tail fins. There's this diamond of soft tissue that was preserved at the end of the tail, and it was accidentally painted over, and the holotype was destroyed in 1945 because World War II has a habit of destroying all the good fossils. What the hell, man? However, a cast resurfaced with the impression there, and that's currently all we have in terms of definitive plesiosaur tail fins. Mark Whitten has a great post on the subject, specifically on whether they had a horizontal fluke or a vertical fin, but I'll get into that more once we get into Cryptoclidus, since that animal comes up a lot more in this particular debate. But TLDR, I lean towards a vertical fin, even though I think a horizontal fluke looks really cool. One last thing I have to mention, the scene where the Liopleurodon bisects the mother Ophthalmosaurus, which I always dreaded when I was little because I thought it was so scary. It's actually supported by fossil evidence. Gordon et al. In 2026 looked at a punctured ichthyosaur vertebrae with a directly associated tooth belonging to a Pliosaurus. This specimen was actually known for over a century, with Marsh himself having acquired it at some point. The authors think that the ichthyosaur was already halved and dead when this bite took place, and that is because if the ichthyosaur was alive, it would have had to bite it like this somehow, since the teeth were going in the direction of the length of the animal, which means that it was probably scavenging it or eating its kill just after cutting it in half. Cryptoclidus eurymeris. Cryptoclidus is our long-necked plesiosaur rep for this episode. While not as impressive as the later elasmosaurids, Cryptoclidus is a very well-studied animal, and the overall anatomy is well known. As a result, the Walking with Dinosaurs model is mostly fine when it comes to its basic anatomy. Most of the problems are due to it being outdated, mainly the soft tissue elements that I discussed in the Liopleurodon section. This results in a much plumper animal with a thick neck. Despite this, it still would be stupidly oversized in the show. The narration states,
All of them are air breathers like this 8-ton Cryptoclidus.
While the evidence book says it measured 7 meters and was lighter than walruses and elephant seals, which weigh up to 2 and 4 tons respectively. The size estimate I use here is found in Zhao's 2026 paper, where he gives specimen NHMUK PVR 2860 a length of 3.542 meters and a mass of 360 kilograms, making the show's version 22 times heavier. I guess that's better than Liopleurodon's 83.6 times, but this is likely an underestimate, as explained in my last video. While it's true that this paper came out 27 years after the show came out, Brown 1981 gave an estimate of 4 meters in a range of 737 to 756 kilograms, so it's only 10.58 to 10.85 times the estimates of the time. The oversized bulk makes the fact that they reconstruct these guys hauling themselves out onto land even more silly. The reason plesiosaurs can't do this is because their hips and shoulders don't connect to their spines, meaning that they can't support any of their weight. To be fair, the evidence book does acknowledge this, but they also say it's possible that the massive downward thrust the flippers could generate would have allowed them to somehow come onto land. This is also where they mention that elephant seals and walruses are heavier and they can come onto land. This feels like special pleading to me. This method of getting onto land only works in the water for that initial thrust. Afterwards, they're kind of stuck. There's also the issue of plesiosaurs not being adapted to hearing things in air. Many of them lost or fused the stapes, which is a small rod-like bone that conducts sound from the eardrum to the inner ear. Microclidus does have a slender separate stapes, so this seems to have varied within the group, but Cryptoclidus does not. Maybe Microclidus partook in spy hopping like modern great whites? That'd be cool. Also, if plesiosaurs could haul themselves onto land like this, they wouldn't need to give birth to live young. While Liopleurodon is much more sluggish, which could maybe be part of why they excluded blubber on the model, ignoring leatherback sea turtles, of course, the reconstruction of Cryptoclidus is quite lively. Motani 2002 calculated that it had a top swimming speed of 0.51 meters per second or 1.84 kilometers per hour. This is faster than the speeds calculated for Platycarpus, Plesiosaurus, and Rhamphorhynchus, but slower than the Ichthyosaurus Stenopterygius, which makes sense given how streamlined Ichthyosaurs were. Something I hadn't even considered until perusing the Plesiosaur directory website is the level of curvature plesiosaurs had in their spines. In his post on the subject, Adam Smith notes that historical reconstructions have a much more curved spine, while modern ones are much straighter. Apparently, this is because plesiosaurs were dorsoventrally flattened, almost never preserving on their sides, and those that do show straight backs. Although some plesiosaurs have pretty much always been depicted this way, the only specimen of plesiosaur that may preserve an arched back is a referred specimen of Coelosaurus, but the dorsals aren't in complete articulation. Interestingly enough, the earliest scientific restorations actually do have straight backs. Zhao reconstructs Cryptoclidus and some others with a fairly arched dorsal series similar to Andrew's reconstruction back in the 1910s. The level of bend in the spine varies in his reconstructions depending on the taxon he's looking at, and he uses mathematical models and regressions which I won't pretend to understand. So I recommend just reading the paper for yourself, as I do when I cite a paper in my videos, because, you know, I'm just one guy. The teeth of Cryptoclidus are tiny and tightly packed together, although not as extreme as those of Aristonektines. They're almost invisible in the show's CGI model, and I thought they had given it lips for a second, but the close-up shots show the teeth more cleanly. The sifting of silt for stones to use as ballasts is a likely idea as well. Okay, the tail debate. I am, once again, pulling heavily from Mark Whitten's blog post on the subject for this, but I looked at the actual papers he cited as well. And I invite you to do the same, since it's very interesting. Plesiosaur tail fins have actually been around for a while. Owen was the first one to propose this, noting the lateral compression of the distal tail vertebrae of Archaeonectes rostratus. He interpreted this as hinting at a vertical tail fin, which was an idea that Whitten says wouldn't really catch on until Danes described the fin of Coelosaurus in 1895. In fact, many historical reconstructions of the 19th and 20th centuries actually show a diamond-shaped tail fin. The earliest examples of horizontal tail flukes are stated to come from Frost 1910 and Wegener 1914. They cited the absence of a bend in the tail, the amount of flexibility the tail had dorsoventrally, and the size of the caudal ribs. The bend in the tail is interesting since this is something that hinted at the tail fins of mosasaurs before we got concrete evidence of it. While paleoart would have tail fins and flukes with varying ubiquity, the main arguments for each in modern times would generally come in the 2010s. On the fin side, we have Wilhelm, Smith, and some others, while the fluke side had Senikov and Otero et al. For the fin side, I can't find Wilhelm's dissertation, so I'm going off of what Whitten said. Wilhelm looked at the well-known tails of the Cryptoclidids, Cryptoclidus, and Muranosaurus, and noted the following features. The neural spines close to the tip of the tail were relatively large, several of them having expanded ends. The orientation of the neural spines shifted at the tail tip, and the caudal vertebrae were laterally compressed. These are similar to characteristics found in finned marine reptiles. He also noted two zones of increased flexion, one at the base of the tail, and one right before the enlarged and reoriented neural spines. Wilhelm's reconstruction looks quite a bit different to the typical reconstructions of Coelosaurus from before, with a concave triangular profile. Wilhelm and Keefe 2010 looked at a cryptoclidid from the Sundance Formation that's referred to Pantosaurus. Here they note that the tail may have had a role in locomotion since the caudal vertebrae have neural spines that are more rounded than those of the sacrals. They believe that this would allow for lateral movement and usage as a rudder. They also note pathologies that could be explained by this movement. The left ilium and ischium in one of the specimens they looked at are rotated compared to their right counterparts, and the tail appears bent to the left. If this individual had damaged or missing flippers on its right side, then they believe it's possible that the tail bent to the left side to provide drag and to counteract the imbalance of propulsion. Smith in 2007 and 2013 noted features similar to what Wilhelm had described, this time in Romaleosaurus. He also found a peculiar node consisting of two shortened vertebrae, which might indicate a slight downturn or a zone of flexion. He also noted that the Romaleosaurid Macroplata had wedge-shaped vertebrae, which might be indicative of a slight downturn. If the finned argument is the true condition, then the Coelosaurus holotype isn't missing much of its soft tissue. A vertical fin could have been used as a stabilizer and may have augmented steering. Senikov notes some of the same characters as the fin side, i.e. the zones of flexion and stiffened proximal vertebrae. Whitten notes that this is because the two sides of this argument are basically the same, just in different planes. Senikov and Otero et al. Note that the caudal ribs in plesiosaurs were quite long, and often led to the caudal vertebrae being wider than they were tall, which would mean a flatter tail and limited lateral movement. Otero et al. Note that Aristonectes had fibrous tips of the caudal ribs for potential soft tissue attachments, and Mauriciosaurus' chunky tail seems to agree with this. They also don't agree with the downturning of the tails, and even attacks it with node vertebrae. Senikov notes analogy with modern cetaceans, sireniids, and sea turtles. Turtles and sireniids have pachystotic trunks, meaning they're thickened and stiff. This means they can't undulate their bodies like reptiles that use lateral movement of their tails to swim like lizards, crocs, and snakes can. These taxa also have limbs as a significant part of their movement, unlike most reptiles which just tuck them to the side. And he further emphasizes the lack of a distinct caudal downturn that's present in finned taxa, the small or absent chevrons, and the low but variable neural spines would enable independent movement from the trunk in the vertical axis. If this ends up being the case, the Coelosaurus specimen is missing more soft tissue. Ultimately, while the horizontal fluke hypothesis is very interesting, I lean more towards vertical flukes. It seems pretty clear that plesiosaurs relied primarily on their flippers, and having a rudder in place of a dorsal fin on the tail makes sense. It's also more developmentally parsimonious. But it's possible both conditions and a lack of a tail fin were all present in different plesiosaur taxa. Otero et al. Do note that elasmosaurids have less mobile tail ends than Cryptoclidus, so there's definitely variation. Okay, here's basically the main character of this episode. Ophthalmosaurus eisenicus. Out of all the show's depictions, this one's probably aged the best. This is because ichthyosaur fossils basically cheat when it comes to preservation. When it comes to this particular taxon, the most famous part is the eyes. The show and the evidence book talk about how Ophthalmosaurus had the largest eyes in the vertebrate world. Motani et al. 1999 write that Ophthalmosaurus had eyeballs with a diameter comparable to that of giant squids, while being a fraction of the length. The sclerotic rings in the orbit would have supported the eyes, but they also would have obscured a lot of the actual eyeball, so the visible portion of the eye should only be as big as the circle within the sclerotic ring. Funnily enough, Ophthalmosaurus is no longer thought to have the largest eyes for their body size invertebrates. Chionichthyosaurus has even larger eyes, and okay, now things are getting kind of ridiculous. The narration states that Ophthalmosaurus had teeth as juveniles to cope with the harder prey in the reefs, and became toothless as adults because they were deep-diving squid eaters. However, the show's animatronic has small teeth. The evidence book agrees with the presence of teeth, writing that a toothless Ophthalmosaurus would have been accurate until relatively recently. This agrees with our modern understanding. Turns out they actually had decently prominent but small teeth, with them being lost in historical specimens. This might mean that the narration was finalized and recorded before they filmed anything, and they were able to change it. Or at least that's what would be the case if Curtin's 1983 thesis didn't exist, which shows an Ophthalmosaurus with teeth. Curtin does note that the teeth aren't fused to the bones of the jaws, suggesting that they were attached by connective tissue. This would explain why it was considered toothless for so long. The teeth were just getting lost after the animal died, or during fossilization, or even preparation. The small teeth and large eyes, along with relatives with stomachs full of cephalopod hooklets, is where the squid eating comes from. The general outline of the model looks quite good. We have all parts of the skeleton in Ophthalmosaurus, although we don't have any one complete skeleton. This well-known mount is a composite of 3 specimens. I would make the spine more slanted as seen in the way articulated specimens look, and this is supported by specimens of Stenopterygius. Stenopterygius might be my favorite ichthyosaur with how good its fossil record is. It and Temnodontosaurus, I think, are my favorites. The fins have a similar problem to plesiosaurs in having less soft tissue on the trailing end than they should. The dorsal fin should be moved further back, over the bend in the spine as seen in the reconstruction from McGowan and Motani 2003. Part of the reason we get such good preservation is that ichthyosaurs had thick skin. Lingam Solar notes that the fibers that made up the smooth scaleless skin of ichthyosaurs were the thickest observed in marine reptiles. It was a complex system that worked to reduce drag, which makes sense for these most streamlined of marine reptiles. Stenopterygius is one of the lucky taxa to preserve traces of melanin, which we can use to infer its color. It was completely dark, similar to a sperm whale perhaps. While I've seen some say that the color scheme in Walking with Dinosaurs is wrong because of this, we have to keep in mind that Stenopterygius isn't even from the same family as Ophthalmosaurus, belonging to Stenopterygiidae. And even if it did, modern animals vary tremendously between taxa when it comes to color. Cetaceans, which are a good analog, show this as well. I mean, look at all these different colored dolphins. The juvenile Ophthalmosaurus have similar issues to the adults, but they did a good job in having rounder proportions and larger eyes as seen in the immature ichthyosaurs we do have. The narration states that
Most sea reptiles return to the land to lay eggs, but not Ophthalmosaurus. They give birth to live young.
And while this does age rather poorly, since plesiosaurs, mosasaurs, and crustodiers also give birth to live young, we have the best evidence for it in ichthyosaurs. We literally have a specimen of Stenopterygius that died while giving birth. Or perhaps this baby was pushed out of the mother by gases after it had already been dead. Or perhaps the mother was already dead and the gases from the bloating pushed the baby out. Either way, the show has them giving birth tail first in order to not have the babies drown before freeing themselves from the mother. This is correct. Or at least I thought it was. Apparently the basal ichthyosauromorph Chowhusaurus was found with a fetus in the birth canal going head first. Eustreptospondylus, which was a basal proper ichthyosaur, also shows this. Myedema et al. 2023, after describing the same phenomenon in Mixosaurus, consider tail-first births to actually be a derived condition in ichthyosaurs, which is very interesting. Also, Stenopterygius actually preserves fetuses in both head and tail-first orientations within the mother. So, just another example of Stenopterygius being an overachiever when it comes to fossils. Apparently, the idea that head-first births lead to asphyxiation comes from long births that were observed in belugas. They cite studies from the early 20th century that document births that took multiple weeks, which is insane. Actual torture, oh my god. Must be how the collected Temnodontosaurus feels. Yeah! I was a bit confused as to why, despite giving birth, the Ophthalmosaurus exhibit no parental care whatsoever. The novelization says that live birth would be unlikely to lead to parental bond, citing the fact that ichthyosaurs were likely cannibals. Whether or not that's the case, there are a ton of cannibalistic animals that exhibit parental care, including the cynodonts from the first episode! With plesiosaurs, it's been inferred that they exhibited parental care since they have one big baby that required a ton of investment, just like cetaceans. Social plesiosaurs are a genre of paleoart that needs more exploration. However, a very recent study by Gu et al. 2026 from July looked at a specimen of Mixosaurus that had a whopping 10 fetuses. Somehow, this isn't the largest litter size in ichthyosaurs though. A specimen of Stenopterygius, it's always Stenopterygius, had 11! The ichthyosaurs that had larger litter sizes probably had a lower level of parental care than those with small litters. Seeing a giant mother Baishanosaurus or Symbospondylus taking care of its young would be so cool. The closest relatives to Ophthalmosaurus that preserve gravid females are the Ophthalmosaurids Myobradypterygius, Myospondylus, and Platypterygius, which had 1, 2, and 1 fetus. This would imply that Ophthalmosaurus itself had small litter sizes and were likely better parents than shown. The annual migration of mothers is inferred from the amount of specimens we have in the same 2 or 3 German Lagerstadt, according to the evidence book at least. All these mothers in the same place might mean something. A nursery is a good hypothesis. Okay, the final named creature in this episode, Rhamphorhynchus Wensteri. Kind of a strange outlier since it's not from the Oxford clay, but from the Solnhofen limestone from Germany. It did, however, live around this time, so that's nice. Rhamphorhynchus is the Stenopterygius of pterosaurs. Or maybe the Cetacosaurus of pterosaurs? What I mean is that it has a stupidly good fossil record. One of my favorite fossils of all time is this. WDCSG255. This is a fossil of Rhamphorhynchus swallowing a Leptolepidis while also getting speared by an Aspidorhynchus. It seems that while Rhamphorhynchus was attempting to enjoy its catch, it got caught in turn. But the resulting struggle ended with both entangled, the Rhamphorhynchus drowning and the Aspidorhynchus asphyxiating. A true example of predatory interactions right there, up there with that Xiphactinus that swallowed a Gillicus over half its size, and the fighting dinosaurs. What's crazy is that this isn't even the only instance of an Aspidorhynchus being associated with a Rhamphorhynchus. There's 5 of them! This is just the most direct one, and the only one where it's certain that the Rhamphorhynchus was alive during the encounter. Okay, sidetrack over, let's get to the actual show's version. This Rhamphorhynchus has many of the same issues that I discussed in the Enurignathus, but it's harder to mess up this genus due to its great fossil record. It still has that patented Walking With Dinosaurs jank, though. The head looks kind of strange, following the right shape in the broad strokes, but the back of the head is too bulbous. I don't know, I've just seen it executed better. It might be because of how sparse the feathers are. The beak ends at an upturned keratinized point, which is accurate, but it's exaggerated at the show, and the harsh separation looks very weird. Witten mentions this keratinization, but has a much more natural looking gradation in his artwork. The teeth are pointy and procumbent, which is accurate, but for whatever reason they have one poking out above the tooth row. There should be 10 on each side of the upper jaw and 7 in each dentary. The show has the right number on the top, but the bottom looks like it has too many. I'm not sure if the weird top tooth is supposed to be pathological and a splash of interest, or if they genuinely thought this was a common feature. The eyes also look a bit too big, remember the sclerotic rings. Rhamphorhynchus is depicted as a skimming animal here, but that isn't borne out by the fossil record. Modern skimmers have elongated lower jaws that are reinforced to withstand the drag of the water and the blunt force impact of knocking into prey. This follows the theme in the show of pterosaurs being water-loving but hating water. As we can see from the specimen I mentioned earlier, Rhamphorhynchus was more than happy to be in the water and likely dove after its prey, or maybe just snatched it from the surface without skimming. The evidence book does mention the unlikelihood of skimming in this genus. Maybe Dawn from Dinosaur Train could pull it off, though. The somewhat squat posture is more accurate here than in other pterosaurs in the show, since Rhamphorhynchus is not a pterodactyloid, and I've seen plenty of modern restorations that show it somewhat crouching. The hands should face outward, not forward, though. We have tracks showing this from multiple different places in the world. The wings should also fold more backwards, not outwards, which would give the animal a narrower frame. The shape of the wings is known from soft tissue impressions, which show that the broad and rounded wings seen in a lot of paleo art is wrong. We must, of course, cover this guy in more feathers. Yes, pycnofibers are most likely feathers. What's very interesting, though, is that the green feathers are not unlikely for a pterosaur at all. Sure, on an animal that lives around aquatic environments, it might be a bit odd, but in this preprint by Wu et al., we learned that the Tapayarid, Cynopterus, had iridescent green feathers. Cynopterus was a terrestrial herbivore with gut contents suggesting hard seeds and other tough plant matter made up the majority of its diet. So there's different evolutionary pressures there, but it's a testament to how creative we can be when reconstructing these pterosaurs. One final note. It would have been cool if the show had multiple different size classes of Rhamphorhynchus. As we know now from the multitude of specimens we have, there was a lot of variation in the size of this taxon. Hone and McDavid described a specimen of Rhamphorhynchus last year that was a third larger than the runner-up, and that one was already significantly larger than other Rhamphorhynchus specimens. And yet, despite this, the proportions are nearly identical, regardless of size. So we have giant versions of average Rhamphorhynchus flying around, which is neat. I mean, hey, I love me some developmental plasticity in my prehistoric reptiles. Holy crap, we forgot to record. Well, that's unfortunate. The extras. Let's just rapid fire talk about the unnamed animals in this episode. The biggest one is Hybotis. This is a very unique looking and highly successful genus of shark, most known from being spiky. It's a genus in need of taxonomic reassessment, with many historical species and an absurd temporal range. It's very clearly a wastebasket. Hybotis obtusus might be what the species represented here is, since it's the only one that makes it to around this time, but it's unclear whether it's a proper member of this genus. Its design looks quite solid to my eyes, thanks in large part to Hybotis being part of the exclusive club of cartilaginous fish that preserve the entire skeleton. I have seen some reconstructions of Hybotis with barbels. Those are those whisker-like appendages on the snouts of some fish like catfish and some sharks like nurse sharks. I'd recommend Tyler Greenfield's blog post on the subject, but it's not really a confirmed feature in Hybodonts. In terms of behavior, it doesn't really do much besides general shark things. I mean, casually swimming around and following food sometimes. Could have been more interesting, but not a bad interpretation if you've seen how boring sharks act sometimes. There are a few ammonites floating around in the water column, but they don't really do much. They don't even come out of their shells. I thought this was just a defense mechanism when the male Ophthalmosaurus investigates one, but I don't think they come out of their shells at all. Soft tissue in ammonites is basically non-existent, so I guess that's one way to do it. I didn't have any idea what species they were meant to be because there are so many different types of the classic spiral ammonite. However, the novelization identifies them as Parasphinctes, and they look fine, but they should have done more. Thank God for Prehistoric Planet, man. The horseshoe crabs are apparently supposed to be of the genus Mesolimulus, at least according to the fandom wiki, which, really great source right there. So I'm assuming the actors they use as stand-ins are the Atlantic horseshoe crabs of the genus Limulus. Mesolimulus used to be assigned to Limulus proper, and from the fossil they look practically identical, so there's nothing really to note here. It's just cool that they're here at all. I hope this was worth the wait. During this project, I developed a new love and appreciation for marine reptiles, especially plesiosaurs. Make sure to like, subscribe, become a member if you want behind-the-scenes posts, early videos, exclusive videos, and polls. I'm going to be uploading all the extra drawings I did in this video's time-lapses on there, so, you know, check it out. Comment your thoughts on this episode, and now I rest until Giant of the Skies. Bye!